So, as many expected, Jake Paul has just beaten Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. And it's gotten to the point now in Jake Paul's career where people are looking at his record and seeing recognisable names like Chavez Jr, Mike Tyson, two people who were at one point genuine world champions in boxing. And people are starting to see Jake Paul as someone who could potentially become a champion at some point, as he continues to learn and improve. So I'm here to give an honest, realistic and genuine assessment of Jake Paul's chances and where he stands as a professional boxer right now. Mainly because I think too many people view Jake Paul as someone who's not a boxer and he just rigs all his fights to win. I don't think the Mike Tyson fight was rigged at all. I think you can easily explain the result of that fight by saying that Mike Tyson was 57 years old. Tyson suffered a genuine medical emergency months before the fight. 20 years previously, Mike Tyson's last professional fight was a fight versus a journeyman in Kevin McBride, and a fight where Tyson looked absolutely terrible and got stopped. But because Mike posted some selectively edited clips of him hitting the pads, some people were somehow convinced that he was going to knock out Jake Paul in the first round. And don't think that me saying the fight's not rigged is a compliment to Jake Paul. I made a whole video before the fight explaining why it was a terrible mismatch and shouldn't be happening, and that became even more true when rumours began to circulate that Mike Tyson had signs of Parkinson's before the fight. And if that's true, Jake Paul is a terrible person for letting the fight go through anyway. Back to the actual topic of the video, there's been certain narratives pushed by Jake Paul himself and his promoters to justify him being a world level fighter based on the Chavez fight, which I disagree with.
Jake, I just want to say one thing. He fought a 39-year-old Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and Zurdo Ramirez fought a 39-year-old opponent. Jake Paul thoroughly outclassed his opponent. Zurdo did not in his, 50th fight or whatever the number of fights are that Zurdo has had. So before people online start to criticize that Jake isn't ready to be champion, they should look at exactly who was his co-main, the person he was fighting, the experience that Zurdo has, and what Jake Paul showed tonight.
First of all, just to explain that statement, the co-main event on the same card as Jake Paul versus Chavez Jr. was Zurdo Ramirez versus Yuniel Dorticos. Zurdo Ramirez is the reigning WBO and WBA unified champion in the cruiserweight division. And what Jake's promoter is saying is that people are criticising Jake for fighting a 39-year-old Chavez Jr., whereas the reigning world champion is also facing a 39-year-old fighter. There is a massive, massive difference between a 39-year-old Yuniel Dorticos and a 39-year-old Chavez Jr. And I'm pretty sure that the promoter said that knowing that most people don't know who Yuniel Dorticos is. Dorticos was the IBF Cruiserweight champion in 2019, after knocking out 17-0 Andrew Tabiti, who was an extremely good boxer in his own right.
Last 30 seconds and he's gone. He's gone.
Dorticos has been a consistently top 5 cruiserweight for the past 8 years. He's only lost one fight since becoming champion, and that was a close competitive majority decision loss to Maris Briedis. Briedis being the best cruiserweight in the world at that point. In my opinion, Briedis is the second best cruiserweight in the entire decade of the 2010s, the best cruiserweight being Alexander Usyk himself, who did go to a razor close decision versus Briedis, and it's still to this day the closest fight of Usyk's career. Dorticos fought Briedis in 2020 and hadn't lost since. So by that point when Zurdo fought him, he was 39 years old, but had a record of 27-2, 25 knockouts, and hadn't lost in 5 years. Just to compare that to Chavez Jr, the last time Chavez was a champion was back in 2012, 13 years ago when he lost to Sergio Martinez. Since then got stopped by Andre Fonfara, lost every round versus Canelo, quit on the stool versus Danny Jacobs, the moment the fight started getting tough in round 5. And it's not like he's just been losing to champions or title challengers. He lost in 2020 to Mario Abel Caceres, someone who's never fought or won outside the Mexican regional level. And I think worst of all lost a convincing decision to 46-year-old UFC fighter Anderson Silva, someone who Jake Paul himself had already beaten. So in my opinion, the Paul Chavez fight wasn't even a step up in any way. So the idea that Jake Paul and Zurdo Ramirez fought very similar fighters couldn't be further from the truth. 39-year-old Chavez would get demolished in the first few rounds versus Dorticos. So this is a classic case of a promoter talking shit.
But people hold the Tommy Fury thing against me, but what now? I just beat a former world champion, and I'm coming to avenge that loss as well with Tommy.
I'd argue that Tommy Fury would also beat Chavez Jr. In fact, if KSI beat Chavez Jr, I would not be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony Joshua.
I think that's the main one that we've talked a lot about is if it's not for the title, it's looking at Tommy, if he's reasonable, and then Anthony Joshua. And he's adamant that he wants to make that fight happen at the end of 2026. and we're going to meet with Matchroom while we're in New York.
So to evaluate, there are 6 names that Jake Paul is open to fighting, people that he's mentioned himself as potential opponents. Out of the 6, a potential Tommy Fury rematch is the most realistic, and also the most winnable by a massive margin. Anthony Joshua is someone they've been talking about, and he's been calling out Canelo since he started boxing. He's also shown interest in the idea of becoming a world champion. He's only mentioned 2 out of the 3 champions at cruiserweight, being Badou Jack and Zurdo Ramirez, and he was also in serious discussions to face Tank Davis. But now Tank is locked in a rematch with Lamont Roach, so I don't think that fight happens anytime soon. I think Jake loses to all 6 of these names. Obviously Tommy Fury being the closest, followed by Tank Davis because he's very small. The next 4, Badou Jack, Zurdo Ramirez, Canelo and Anthony Joshua, would destroy him and stop him. He'd be the least embarrassed by Badou Jack in my opinion. I don't think Badou should even be champion right now. I thought he lost the decision versus Noel Mikhailian. I shouldn't need to explain Canelo, Zurdo and especially Anthony Joshua. I don't want to sound too harsh because there are compliments I can give to Jake Paul as a boxer. For someone who's only been taking boxing seriously very recently, he has picked up the sport very well. He can move decently well, he's got decent timing, he's obviously got power. I think his shot selection is the best part about him. He's great at mixing it to the body and to the head. But what we see time and time again is that when it gets difficult, when he gets pressured, he does seem to fall apart quite easily. He's not fought anyone that's really made him pay for that, mainly because of his level of competition. But even watching the Mike Perry fight, for example, the way Jake was looking in round 3 and 4 in that fight is what you'd expect of a professional boxer who's just gone 10, 11, 12 rounds. If you look at him, his face has gone completely red, his mouth is wide open to breathe, and that is concerning considering the fight wasn't really at an extreme pace. Jake was winning clearly before this point, and to be honest, even offensively in his best moments, he still looks quite sloppy, he still overextends, he's still got this thing where he sort of falls over himself while throwing combinations, and we saw him struggle again when the pace got difficult in the last 2 rounds versus Chavez Jr. I think someone who's durable and presses forward from the very start would be a nightmare for Jake Paul. There may be a response to that because Chavez Jr. technically is that sort of fighter, but I was so confident in Jake Paul winning that fight, to the point where I put £800 on him to win. Because Chavez at this point of his career does not put pressure on anyone. He just sort of stands there and takes punches on the gloves until he either quits because it's too hard or the other guy slows down in the case of Jake Paul, which is exactly how the fight played out. I think it is also quite telling that Jake has mentioned 2 out of the 3 cruiserweight champions, but has never once mentioned the best cruiserweight, Jai Opetaia. Opetaia is the 3rd champion in that division, and he's by far the best out of the 3. He's an absolute beast, an athletic monster, murderous punching power, hand speed, foot speed. He's got a great chin as well, he's great on the inside, great on the outside. I don't think Jake is delusional enough to think he'd win that fight, or even survive to the 2nd round, which is why he's never been mentioned. To actually answer the question of the video, where does Jake Paul stand in the cruiserweight division, and how close is he to becoming champion? Looking at the Ring Magazine top 10, he doesn't crack the top 20. Even guys on the lower half like Leonardo Mosquera are simply a different level in every single way. And if Jake Paul did step up to this level, it would become clear that Jake's only been doing boxing for 4 or 5 years. Because at this point he's boxing against guys who've been boxing since they were teenagers, or even children, so they're at least 15 years deep in their careers. And there's also guys here who are simply different athletes compared to Jake Paul, like Jai Opetaia, like Chris Billam-Smith, like Mikhail Seslak. Just to explain the quality of the guys who aren't even inside the top 10 right now. A fight that took place recently between 2 lower-end top 20 cruiserweights was Vidal Riley versus Chev Clark. Look at the speed, fluidity and technique of Vidal Riley, someone who the Ring Magazine does not consider good enough yet to be in the top 10, and he's facing a legitimate contender in Chev Clark. Chev Clark being someone who in the British amateurs was one of the best cruiserweights in recent years. I think it's a night and day comparison between the fluidity of a guy like Vidal Riley and a guy like Jake Paul. The footwork is different, the technique is different, the snap is different, the accuracy is different, the defense, the counter-punching, everything. If he's serious about being a professional boxer, he's got to contend with guys who are just physically monstrous and far better than him athletically, like Brandon Glanson, because Jake Paul athletically is not very impressive at all. This should be obvious by now, but he's so much more uncoordinated. His technique definitely needs work, he's very easy to back up to the ropes. And based on the Mike Perry fight, if he looks that slow in the 3rd round versus a real boxer, he's in for a very bad night. This is quite obvious to most people who know boxing by now, but I've seen some takes out there. Mainly from people who aren't really hardcore boxing fans, who might not understand the scale of a division and how hard it is to crack the top 10. So to give an actual answer of where Jake Paul is in the cruiserweight rankings, we've established by now he's not even top 20, but there are certain professionals I would pick Jake Paul to beat, Tommy McCarthy being one of them. He just doesn't take the sport seriously anymore. Someone like Emil Markic, who loses every time he steps out of a certain level, but a couple steps beyond that like Umar Salamov or Alexei Egarov, Any boxer who's recently fought for a world title, whether they lost or not, is simply a step too far. BoxRec has both Jake Paul and Tommy Fury listed. Fury at 64, Jake Paul at 69. I think that's still too high because that suggests they're above guys like John Hedges or Ellis Zorro, but I do think he can potentially beat a guy like Artur Man, who got stopped by Sergey Kovalev in the year 2025. So I think if you move up a few guys like John Hedges or Ellis Zorro, I think Jake Paul and Tommy Fury are around the 70 to 80 range. So he's got a lot of work to do before becoming champion. And that's going to do it for the video. Like and subscribe. Let me know what you think. Goodbye.